For my After Five guest, and the last time my After Five guest was with me, this is to talk about her book, Travellers in the Third Reich. She's back with a new book called The Villagers in the Third Reich, How Ordinary Lives Were Transformed by the Rise of Fascism. It's a warm welcome back to Julia Boyd. Thank you for talking to us today.
How lovely of you to ask me again. Thank you very much.
Also in the book, I must say that Angelina Patel was also co-writing the book with you, isn't she?
Yes, her family has lived in the village for about 5 generations. And to be honest, there is no way as a foreigner I could have turned up in this village, and I hadn't even heard of it until I met Angelica. And so, I'm going to write a book about your village during the Nazi period. So it was a lovely collaboration. We got on very well, and I couldn't have done it without her.
So did soldiers returning from World War One and also the Treaty of Versailles encourage early Nazism in the village?
Not really. In fact, it was very slow to take hold in Oberstdorf, National Socialism. But a postman was sent there who had been wounded in the war, and he was a very keen Nazi, and he was the first one who tried to build up a branch of the Nazi party. But it wasn't very successful. The village was very devoutly Catholic, and they weren't terribly impressed by the Nazis for a long time. And also they were a resort. They earned a lot of money from people who came from the north, and they were much more interested. Many of them were Jews. So the nasty, horrible newspaper that Julius Reich produced, called Beobachter, attacked the village for allowing Jewish visitors. But they were hard. They were interested in making money, and Jewish people brought money, as indeed did many others, and so they weren't particularly anti-Semitic, nor were they particularly interested in the Nazis until after the Reichstag was burned down, and that, because it was thought to be burned down by communists, that's really what changed their minds.
So then, despite the depression, Oberstdorf did okay then, really through winter sports.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting. After the sort of awful hyperinflation, which did affect the villagers, and then the depression after the Wall Street crash, Oberstdorf didn't do too badly because it was a tourist resort, and because of the depression, Germans couldn't travel abroad as they had got used to doing, and many of them came to Oberstdorf, so they did slightly better than a lot of other places in Germany.
So, I'm right to say that the Nazi Party won the election in 1930 in the village, though, so it was starting to spread, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed. And I think that the main motivation from the village's point of view was that they longed for a strong government. They, all sorts of rumours were flying around about them having to pay even more money to the French. Of course, there were reparations after the war. Mm-hmm. They hated the French. And they felt that the Weimar government was hopeless. There were too many parties. It was ineffective, and so we think of Weimar as being full of wonderful sort of innovation, new art and theatre and music and so on. But if you were looking at it from down in the south, and Oberstdorf is the most southern village in Germany, you thought they were a lot of sort of not very serious people, and their lives were. In Berlin, Weimar Berlin was about as different from Catholic Oberstdorf in the Bavarian Alps as you could imagine. So they weren't impressed by all that stuff. What they wanted was a healthy economy. They wanted the French to be put in their place, and they wanted strong government. And they came round to the conclusion that Hitler would provide that for them.
So you mentioned that the village was very Catholic, but how did the village church and priests receive the Nazis then?
Well, it's very interesting. It was quite a sort of tug-of-war, particularly with the young people. The Nazis were very clever at capturing the young. They realized it was essential that they get youth on their side because they were boasting their empire was going to last 1,000 years. So they really brainwashed young people from a very young age. And although a lot of the children in Oberstdorf had been brought up as Catholic, they, for instance, the party offered free cinema tickets on a Sunday to coincide with Holy Mass. And of course, most of the boys chose to go to to the cinema rather than to Mass.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were very clever. And also, these children were used to working from a very young age on the farm, which was very hard work. And suddenly they were offered this alternative, joining the Hitler Youth, or the girls' version of it. And they sang songs and went on camping trips and learned how to ride and do all sorts of exciting things, which was much more fun than swilling out a cowshed. So the Nazis were very successful in taking over the youth and eroding parental authority.
So Hitler comes to power in 1933, becomes Chancellor, and then I don't know if this affects the village, but the Equalization Act would affect the Jews in the village, wouldn't it?
Well, there were very, very few Jews in the village.
Right.
So the Jews didn't really... What it did affect, though, Oberstdorf, like most German communities, had lots and lots of societies. And they had societies for zither playing and beekeeping and country dancing, you name it, they had a society for it. And what the equalization law did was to make them all conform to Nazi regulations. So they weren't allowed to admit any Jews, so-called Aryan rule, and they had to Heil Hitler, and even Christian societies had to, Heil Hitler. And it was, in a way, it was what that law was about, was getting Nazi tentacles into every single aspect of life, even at the village level, even at the level of the zither society. And they wanted, in essence, to take over people's heads. They wanted to get inside their minds. They wanted to absolutely control every aspect of German society.
Right, I see, yep. So let's move on to the war then. And then you've got young people, or young men, that should leave the village to be involved in the war effort, and also, of course, blitzkrieg and things like that. And also they also go into the 1st Mountain Division as well, don't they? So it then does it then start to affect them?
Well, yes. To begin with, the blitzkrieg was a sort of miracle. They were terribly humiliated after the First World War, and they minded that as much as they minded not having enough to eat and the grief of having lost their loved ones. They really hated the humiliation. They felt that their country was a pariah, whereas they felt Germany should be right up there at the top table of nations. So when Hitler won this astonishing, quick victory in the Blitzkrieg in 1940, even people who had their suspicions or doubts about Hitler were very proud of their boys, very proud of seeing their Germany, knocking the hell out of all these other people, especially the French. And it was really when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, in that Barbarossa, as it was called, that was really when people began to worry, because when that began to stall and fail, and the winter was very harsh, and also so many people were killed, and that's when things really turned around for the village. And for a whole of Germany, of course. But that's when they began to feel worried and anxious, and things really went from bad to worse after that.
And casualties obviously coming back into the village as well from Barbarossa.
Yes. Yeah. And I think another aspect of that is, of course, there were soldiers coming back on leave. And these soldiers had seen terrible things in the East, and very often presumably had taken part in murders themselves. And there was one man whose family lived in Oberstdorf, who was in the Einsatzgruppe, which was this horrible, hideous unit that went in after the Wehrmacht and murdered Jews and gypsies and homosexuals and anyone else the Nazis didn't like. And so the village must have known quite a lot what was going on, because their own young men were coming back and would have, not in public, but would have, in the privacy of their houses or perhaps walking up in the mountains, have unburdened themselves as to all the things that they'd seen.
Yes, and also in the book as well, you use journal entries as well from soldiers, which gives you a real effect of what's actually happening to them.
Doesn't it just? Yeah. We were very lucky to not only to locate those diaries, but to be given permission by the families, because you can imagine it's quite sensitive. And in fact, the name of one of them we did change, but it's an extraordinary account. And there are so many vivid snapshots of what it was like. These two diaries, I think, were a great find, and I think greatly enriched the book.
Yeah, it did. It does. It gives you that feel, doesn't it? What's happening? Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Yes, you feel you're there.
Yeah.
You know, you can see. It's almost like having a movie in your head. You can see it, and particularly, I think the officer who described in minute detail his journey from Oberstdorf to the East Front, in Ukraine, ironically enough. You know, he got such a feel of what it was like, and as he got closer, he could hear the gunfire, and then the horror stories of the civilians and with nothing to eat and the freezing cold and getting stuck in the mud. It's all incredibly vivid.
So let's move, Julia, towards the end of the war. Was there a connection between the village and the plot to kill Hitler?
Well, there was one astonishing link. Ludwig Beck, who would have been the new Chancellor, had this plot succeeded, he would have taken over from Hitler. And his daughter, as it so happened, was living in Oberstdorf with her 3-year-old daughter. And I was immensely lucky because Caroline Neubauer, who is now an old lady herself, of course, was incredibly generous and let me quote from letters that her daughter wrote because her father was, after the bomb plot, her father was shot. And then his daughter was arrested. And again, it's all incredibly vivid. But it's the extraordinary thing about Oberstdorf is that although it is this remote village, and I thought when I started on this project, how can I write about the Second World War from a point of view of an alpine village, miles from anywhere, 100 miles from Munich? But the extraordinary thing is there was really not a single aspect of the war that one couldn't cover from the Oberstdorf perspective. Even though there weren't many Jews there were some, and their experiences were enough to be able to sort of talk quite cogently about the Jewish situation, and the Holocaust. So I was really surprised by that, and pleased, of course, because it meant that I felt the book was more valuable because so many different aspects of the war actually touched Oberstdorf.
So in Oberstdorf, then, after surrender, am I right in saying there might have been some, if I'm right in describing this right, as SS Wolf regiments?
Well, they weren't really, there was a great worry from the Allies, particularly the Americans, who were the main occupying force in Bavaria, that there would be a Nazi resistance. And indeed, they did try to start one called the Werwolf, but it didn't really come to anything. But what it did do was generate a lot of fear. Now, there was this, in a way, it reads a bit like a thriller at the end of the war, because there were people in the village who wanted to surrender to the Allies so that their village wouldn't be bombarded and destroyed. But there were others who were dedicated Nazis. And of course, the very strict rule was that anybody who put a white flag up would be shot on the spot. And nobody really knew who was who. And there was worry that there are a lot of Nazis in the mountains. And there was a Waffen-SS training camp just outside the village. So it was incredibly volatile, and nobody knew really what anybody else was doing. But amazingly enough, they did manage to get together a resistance group, which with great speed arrested all the Nazis just before the French arrived. And so the village was saved. It was a very hairy operation, and the fact that it was kept secret and nobody knew was amazing. So Oberstdorf was saved. It was handed over to the front. And a few days after the war was over, General de Gaulle came to the village, and there was a great victory parade. So Oberstdorf, again, surprisingly for this remote village, was again at the centre of events.
Let me just finally ask you then. Nazis, as you said, returned to normal life. Some were involved in the Holocaust as well, so that was still going on, wasn't it? They were still people who'd done parts of the Holocaust, but then became normal people afterwards.
Well, There were, particularly this man who was a member of the Einsatzgruppe. He was tried at Nuremberg along with others. And, they weren't just thugs. There was a priest, there was an opera singer, there was a philosopher, there were several lawyers. It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
But he said something very telling at his Nuremberg trial. He said to the prosecutor, we thought we were saving Western civilization. And I think this underlines the brainwashing that these men had as young men, as teenagers from the Nazi regime. And the thing about his name was Heinz Schubert, and he claimed to descend from the Schubert family, the family of the composer. And you can't quite get your head around that Schubert, who is one of the most beloved composers that ever lived, that some descendants of his, and this man was responsible for organizing the murder of 700 gypsies in Crimea. So it's I think this is one of the reasons why we all continue to be so horrified and what's the right word, to try and understand what happened in Germany, because Germany was such a seat of extraordinary civilization and rational thought and philosophy and music and literature and architecture. No young man joined the foreign service in between the wars without spending time in Germany. It was such a sort of focal point of all that was good in Western culture, and that it should have turned into this. And this man, Heinz Schubert, in a sense epitomizes the horror of it all.
Well, Julia, it's a fantastic read. It's an incredible book. More than I can cover in this interview today, because it's absolutely fantastic and detailed in there. Yeah. And so that's the book, which is called A Village in the Third Reich by Julia Boyd and Angelika Patel. And, of course, as well as that, people can also pick up as well Travellers in the Third Reich now, and they can read that book first if they want to, and then go on to your book. It's like a little set, isn't it, those two books together?
Well, yes, it was never meant that way. It wasn't planned, but it turns out that actually the books do make quite they're different because they're coming from completely different angles. But the point is to try and get sort of inside, to get a sense of what it was really like to be there at the time. And that's what I was trying to do anyway.
And you certainly do that, that's for sure.
Thank you so much, Wyn.
That's wonderful. Well, thanks for being my After Five guest again, and maybe one day we'll meet in the future again.
I do hope so. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for being with me today.
Have a nice weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.